Prof. Sorry, it's Jessie. Our group today is going to be presenting on the topic of appraising evidence. So to start with, if we look at EBM, the newest school of thought is that we start calling it evidence-based practice instead of evidence-based medicine, because the word practice is considered a more encompassing term to include patient care as opposed to purely evidence output that isn't necessarily patient-centered. There are 5 steps in the process of evidence-based medicine. Appraisal is the 3rd step and dedicated to finding and refining patient care to be in line with the best available evidence that we have at our disposal. So this appraisal step acts as a bridge between finding your evidence and then deciding whether it's applicable to clinical practice. So under broad headings, the appraisal process entails assessing evidence for validity as well as clinical usefulness, which we'll expand on later in the presentation to give some definitions. The key concepts that relate to these principles when going through evidence are study design, validity, which includes internal and external validity, as well as reliability and bias, which we'll extrapolate on later. So these concepts are important to understand so that we can critically analyze the value of the evidence that we find. So what is the whole reason we need to do this? The reason is that not all evidence is equal. So different study designs have innate quality of evidence ascribed to them. However, within those subtypes of studies, you get different qualities of evidence. So it's important to appraise them and not just take them at face value. So for example, just because a study is a randomized controlled trial doesn't mean that it's more significant or important than a cohort study that could present more significant applicable evidence to answer your clinical question. So this is why we have the guidelines from the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine that we can apply.
So as Jessie's mentioned, there's a few key concepts. I'm just going to explain them further. And when we are choosing a study design, we essentially need to ask what is our question and how do we answer it. So we need a focus question, and we do this based on the PICO approach. So just to remind everyone, it's the population, the interventional exposure, control, comparison, outcome, and then it depends if on the study type, but there might be a time element to it as well. And when we ask a focus question, we're making finding evidence easier as well as finding more consistent and comparable results. So does the research use valid methods to answer the proposed question? So with this, we're going to look at validity, and as Jessie's mentioned, internal and external validity. And then there needs to be an analysis of the full methodology of the study. So with validity, there's internal and external. So internal validity describes a cause-effect relationship, which can be demonstrated in many ways, depending on what exposure and outcome is being measured. In medical literature, we often use the Bradford-Hill criteria for cause and effect. One variable is the type of study used, which again pertains to the perceived quality of evidence. Other criteria Other criteria include demonstrating a strong correlation between exposure and outcome, a dose-response gradient, a temporal relationship between exposure and outcome, and a biological plausible explanation for the outcome from the exposure. So this is essentially just the one variable being related to another. Whereas with external validity, it can either depend on the population or the ecology. So we have population validity, which is the reasonability of results being applied to a broader population, but still relates to the population in the sample. And ecological validity, which is the ability to apply the evidence to groups in other situations and settings in the real world. This requires analysis of sample selection and experimental methods to determine if the study fits these criteria. Validity in these spheres are not dichotomous, much like bias. It's not a question if there is validity or not, but rather how valid is the study. There's also a trade-off between the two types of validity. As a tighter control, the variables may generate more internal validity at the cost of external validity. However, that does not necessarily make the evidence less significant to practice within a population. Significance depends on where the evidence is being applied. So you'll decide based on your study and on your question if internal or external validity is more important. Then we have reliability. So reliability is essentially, can we replicate the results? So certain studies are designed, such as systematic reviews, implicitly test reliability of evidence. Assessing reliability requires analysis of the study design to determine if the evidence is comparable, and then how consistent the results are if comparable studies are repeated. And then, as mentioned, bias is also a spectrum. It's not dichotomous, and we have to ask how much bias is there and where is it being applied, as opposed to if it is there or not. So you need to decide based on our study and our question, is this bias important at influencing the study and the results that we're looking for?
So then basically using all of these key concepts, we're going to go through a process of appraisal to determine whether our studies are significant to the population we're looking to apply them to. So when we look at the study design, like we did earlier, we kind of answer the first two questions already. So we're asking if we address this clearly focused question, and are we using valid methods to actually address this question instead of using a method that doesn't fit, which we'll give an example of later. And the third step is relating to, are these results of the study important? Are the valid results of the study important? An important distinction. And then the fourth step is, are these valid, important results important to my patient or population that I'm looking to apply it to? And if you look, you can actually see on the question, they sort of compound the relation of the evidence here. So it starts off valid, then it asks, are the valid results important, and are the valid important results applicable or important? And the reason for that is, at any stage, if the answer to your question is no for that question, and you're looking to apply it to a population, you may as well disregard the study. Because if you're not meeting any of those criteria, you're not meeting an important point for applying evidence. Yeah. So then we're just given the frameworks in simpler terms of how we're actually going to go through this process. So it's not as simple as a yes, no answer for everything. Maybe the easiest one to answer is actually, are we asking a focused question? Because that's probably the easiest yes or no. But once we go through the rest of them, like we were describing with our key concepts, a lot of what we're going through is a spectrum, and we're looking at how acceptable or how unacceptable our results are. So with validity, in our second step, we're again looking at a spectrum. We're looking at internal, external validity. Are we accepting the degree of internal and external validity? Are we accepting the level of bias in the study? Do we think the study design is acceptable to present the evidence that's being stated? And are we using the right inclusion and exclusion criteria in our method to actually generate evidence that is valid? Then the next step is asking, are these valid results important? So then the biggest determining factor we use here, beyond just the concepts of looking at whether or not it's relevant to our population, if we can replicate it, are these results reliable? One of the biggest things we use in our larger studies and our systemic reviews and such are the powers of the study. So in medicine, we often use our p-value, which is basically a constant that is ascribing a certain level of what we call confidence. So essentially, determining the probability that any significant results have occurred by chance. In medicine, we tend to use the p-value of 5%. So we have a 95% confidence interval. We'll see that quoted in literature multiple times. But it's also important to actually reflect on whether the power of your study is appropriate to what you're examining. For example, lots of our studies where we use 5%, it might be appropriate that 95% of our interventions, or rather our intervention works with 95% confidence in our patients. But say, for instance, if we're looking at medical genetics where we're dealing with multiple variables, so a lot more considerations and a much smaller room for error, you might make your p-value a lot smaller because you don't want a 5% room for error. You'd want something like a 0.001% room for error. So we need to decide whether the power that is ascribed to the study is actually appropriate for the study we're doing. Then we're going to look at whether the results that are important, that are valid, whether they're actually applicable to our population. And this, again, it actually reflects on our previous two questions. So when we're talking about validity and bias not being dichotomous, we need to decide in that trade-off of internal and external validity and with the level of bias that we've given with our selection, with our methods, we need to decide whether or not the amount of validity and bias is acceptable to be applied to a patient population. So for example, often we don't actually necessarily do studies of interventions that relate to the entire population. We often look at specific demographics. So a small example we'd give is looking at for instance, the efficacy of amlodipine in African patients. When we do designing a study to examine that, we might narrow down our variables. We might narrow down our population to African populations of a certain age. We might narrow it down to new diagnoses of hypertension, and our control group might be non-African populations. We're then not necessarily able to apply that to a broader population, but for the purposes of our study and the purposes of our practice, where we're looking to apply it to a certain population, that evidence is then applicable. Even though we might not have particularly great external validity by its parameters, there might be some bias in our selection, and we've excluded a significant portion of the population. We are actually looking at a specific population, and on that level of validity, we're deciding that it's applicable to the group we've decided to apply it to. Then we're actually just dealing with general public health issues as well. So not just the results of the study, but we need to look at our broader environment of healthcare. So if we have an intervention, is it actually available? Is it viable? And do we have appropriate benefits outweighing the risk? So a lot of our guidelines in South Africa, for instance, we have determined them based on studies that look at low-cost interventions and maximizing the outcome based on these low-cost interventions. If we then look at studies from overseas where they might have more expensive interventions, they may be more effective, but in our setting, it's not really appropriate. So your application of to your patient or your population does very much hinge on which population you're applying it to, and you can reflect back on where your study is directed to make a decision on that. And if we answer yes to all those questions, we then have something we can actually use as evidence for changing practice. Because we've decided that the evidence we've appraised is significant and it can actually be applied with significance to our population. And then we follow the rest of the steps of our EVP process, which is then applying our guidelines, applying our practice and evaluating whether it's worked or not. But that isn't necessarily part of our appraisal. That's part of the evidence-based practice approach. So, I mean, we picked the low-hanging fruit for this. It's a pretty easy example, but I think it gives very good explanation to the concepts we're talking about here. I think Andrew Wakefield has been the low-hanging fruit for describing study design and how valid results are and things we should appraise. But it's an excellent example because this wasn't just a study that we determined was poor. It was a study we determined was poor after it was published in The Lancet, which is one of our most prestigious medical journals. So I think it's an excellent example to describe what we're actually looking at. So in terms of his question, and just as a preface to this, we had to actually gather literature on criticisms of his study because it was, I mean, it's been so rejected that it's pretty difficult to find any semblance of it other than in reference. So we've been looking at criticisms of it. So it's not directly sourced from the study method itself and the literature quotes itself. But from what we gathered from the criticisms was that he actually asked a pretty focused question. He was looking at children with autism and we switched that around. MMR is supposed to be the intervention, or autism is supposed to be the outcome. He was looking at children who were exposed to MMR vaccine, the risk for autism, and then the control group being children without autism. However, when we start going into the methods and validity of results, we start hitting problems. So when we get to step 2, the answer to whether the methods are valid is already no. So he gives it's a case report sort of evidence presented, but that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is more so related to how his strong biases and his ulterior motives. So he had a very strong selection bias that was deemed unacceptable. So in this study, he was essentially looking at a cause-effect relationship, which is very difficult to determine in case reports. In most study designs, it's actually very difficult to determine causality. I think the basic levels of studies we look at, we look at prospective studies. So your cohort studies and your randomized control trials actually adequately assess causality more so than other types of studies that are points in time or retrospective studies. And his selection bias was incredibly strong. He chose a population with the outcome. So in this population, his subgroup was actually children who already had autism. So with bias being a factor that strongly favors an outcome, choosing the entire outcome is not really an acceptable way to analyze whether there's causality or not. And then there's his other issues, no ethical clearance, which isn't necessarily the issue. Even if he had got ethical clearance, the study design was flawed and his selection and sample was flawed. And he had his own interests in generating results that showed that MMR did in fact cause autism. So the answer to this question is already no. It should not have been sort of addressed further if it was appraised before it actually reached the heights of medical literature that is The Lancet. But even if those methods were valid, we then start looking at whether those results are valid and important. And the main concept here is looking at the power of the study. Even if his results weren't falsified, which is another crucial aspect of this, even if his results were not falsified, his sample size was incredibly small. So when we look at power, we can actually calculate a sample size. There are multiple tools online to use this that actually have been developed by people in the stats field as opposed to the medical field, thankfully. And a sample size of 12 is just not appropriate to extrapolate to a general population, which is what he ended up doing. Later on, then there were replicated studies and further studies that showed there was actually no correlation. It disputed his findings. But just on face value of actually looking at the study, his sample size was significantly underpowered. And then the application to the patient population, I think, is fairly obvious from now. If the answer to question 2 was no, obviously the answer to question 4 is going to be no. But because his study had such strong bias, it wasn't an appropriate study design. He had his own interests. It was underpowered. It wasn't a reliable study that could be replicated. His study was entirely invalid in the first place. It was definitely not applicable to the general population, which is what's ended up happening really, and it's influenced to this day since 1998, despite its dispute. So again, I think low-hanging fruit, but strong example of why we need to appraise evidence. And that's really our conclusion here, that appraisal of evidence is important. So basically, it's like the instance of Andrew Wakefield and many other medical literatures as well. The existence of evidence does not make it significant. Just because it's there doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best evidence, doesn't necessarily make it good evidence either. And this appraisal process actually prevents poor quality evidence from slipping through the cracks and leaking into practice and leaking into our ideas about medicine. So even the Lancet makes those mistakes evidently, and we as practitioners need to be able, even if we're not higher up making guidelines and like our standard treatment guidelines that we use, on an individual basis, if you're looking for evidence, to be able to actually assess whether the evidence is good or bad is a good characteristic to have. And then if we go through this process and we can actually generate good practice, we improve our patient care. And that's really the crux of why appraisal evidence is important. There's a lot of personal agenda. There's a lot of, you can slate literature and things like that. But the importance really is that our appraisal should promote and elevate patient care. Yeah, so that's our conclusion of evidence appraisal. We have a couple of sources here. But yeah, that's our bit on appraisal of evidence.
Thank you very much. Just before you take that slide off, I think if you were to turn that statement upside down, much like your MMR on autism ought to have been, the existence of significance does not make it evidence is also important. I think it's the point you're making in some ways about clinical significance. Sometimes people get caught up in statistical significance and don't think about what really matters, whether it really matters as in terms of practice. So be very careful in looking at studies where the focus is very much on a p-value and very fixated on that. And yet when you look at the value of the evidence, it is a bit tenuous. So be careful of that. I think the in all of your sort of reflections on any article that you get, you should obviously have an understanding of the hierarchy of evidence and not just treat any paper because of what it says simply as true, but to be able to examine what that hierarchy is. In your reading, generally, you should be looking for reviews, mostly systematic reviews. You get other types of reviews that are, because systematic reviews are literally struck around randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses, essentially trying to pick up that. Meta-analyses being the data pulled together, whereas systematic reviews are basically pulling the RCTs in terms of the overall evidence around it. So this is RCT based, but you get other types of reviews that try to bring the evidence together where there's not enough in the way of randomized controlled trials, and you should be familiar with it. So when you're looking for evidence in any way, look at reviews as part of your search terms. And you should know that, that below RCTs, what the kind of methodologies are, whether it is case, right down to case reports, but understanding that what are the differences between RCT and perhaps a cohort study. So you wanna look at what is a case control. How am I actually? It's not experimental. It tends to look at what is something that occurred, and so you've got to sort of understand it, that it's not quite as rigorous as an experimental situation where you control lots and you put in something. Most of the problem is that kind of evidence is only drug-based or intervention-based, and you've got to manage the circumstance a lot to get that kind of evidence around things that are hard to experiment with. Examples are intervention that is perhaps large scale or complex or hard to blind. So these are things that you need to appreciate some of the difficulty around building up that evidence. So evidence-based practice is kind of something that people are saying is kind of limited in its own in itself, and one needs to think more broadly than just the kind of things where you can find statistical differences. Even qualitative research now is being brought together to look at the quality of the evidence. So there are a number of guidelines, and invariably, if you are publishing, as you all might land up doing sometime in the future, look at the sort of design type, the best practice guidelines around that particular design. Often editors of journals come together, or peers come together around a particular method, and they develop a guideline for the method and suggest how one should be scrutinizing an article. So if you read something that's got a Delphi study as the design, you can look at the guidelines to suggest how should one evaluate a Delphi study, or a case control, or a, an RCT, etc. So this helps you to not get caught up in just simply stats blind, but look at it more holistically. Are all the things that should have been done to make it valid, true, there, and reliable, of course. So anyway, thank you. Any questions, any comments from anybody? Of course, you understood that you needed to switch around MMR and autism. It should have been MMR or no MMR. And then autism is the outcome. Okay. No questions?